Hello, I'm Mark New. I'm Director of the African Climate and Development Initiative here at the University of Cape Town. I was fortunate to be at the COP21 in Paris, particularly for the second week, where things were getting first tense, then exciting, and then we didn't know what was going to happen. In terms of what came out of the COP, a few reflections. I think it's great that we've got an agreement that shows ambition, ambition to keep global temperatures well below 2 degrees. A process by which countries have to lay out their contributions to achieving those targets. And I think quite importantly, the expectation that those national contributions are progressively ratcheted up. So each cycle of producing a nationally determined contribution is meant to be more and more ambitious. Also, the recognition that adaptation is equally important in responding to climate change, especially for developing countries, and some sort of confirmation that there is funding, a recognition that funding is needed to enable developing countries to achieve both their mitigation, emissions reduction, and their adaptation targets, if you like. Everybody's been talking about what the gaps are as well. A few sort of reflections from my side. A great vagueness on the timing of when we need to reach zero or near zero emissions. So that really leaves a lot of wiggle room for actually, in reality, overshooting the 2 degrees target. Sort of tied to that, a big gap between the current pledges in terms of emissions reductions and what's required by science to avoid 2 degrees. So the current pledges take us to about 2.5 degrees above pre-industrial at best. This is no ways ambitious enough. There's obviously an even bigger gap then to this new target of 1.5 degrees that looks to me actually unachievable given current levels of ambition in terms of what countries are proposing for their emissions reductions. And I think the problem is that this ambition gap in terms of what's being proposed by different countries, most of it lies in the developed world and in the big emerging economies. The big emitters are the ones who are actually furthest away from producing the kind of cuts that are needed to produce or to end up with the temperature targets that were agreed. There seems to be a reliance on some kind of silver bullet that's going to give us what people call negative emissions later on to get to these targets. So essentially sucking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. This is technology that is unproven and probably isn't going to operate at the scale that's required. And then, although there's agreement that funding is needed, the targets on the funding are vague, and it's also not clear whether this is actually new funding to support climate responses or just a recycling of old funding away from traditional development into just rebadging it as climate funding. I think it means taking the renewable contribution to South Africa's energy mix further and further and implementing other policy regimes, perhaps the carbon tax, perhaps not, that are going to drive efficiency and encourage take-up of more renewables. I think a need to make an informed rather than a entrepreneurial approach or decision on nuclear. So nuclear could be an important part of a zero-carbon economy, but it's got to be done on best science and economics rather than on political economic decision-making. And then start a process today already about thinking about what these future national determined contributions are going to look like. We can't have a last-minute rush job when the next one is due. It's got to be carefully planned and thought out and actually have a design that is feasible, that actually sort of brings to fruition what I was talking about earlier, putting money where your mouth is. How are you going to achieve these more ambitious future nationally determined contributions? And then I think a big gap in South Africa, as in most developing countries, is actually the capacity to actually deliver on the ambition. And by capacity, I mean mostly human capacity. So there's a big challenge in building the capacity of the actors and the institutions who are meant to be delivering on this ambition to actually be able to respond in a way that really does make a difference. So those are my sort of short reflections. Clearly, things are going to emerge over the next year or two that will put much more detail into whether the Paris Agreement is going to deliver on the ambition. But we certainly have an interesting few years ahead in taking ambition and making it real in practice.